My name is Jaison Omoto, a postdoc in the lab of Geffen Donlea in the neurobiology department at UCLA. Most of you probably did the same thing last night. You all slept. Every one of us takes part in this lifelong seesaw, going back and forth between being awake and being asleep. The balance between these two states is critical for a healthy and happy life and has widespread implications on society. For example, recent studies are starting to look more carefully at the start times for classes in schools for adolescents. And it turns out it's probably better they're not forced to wake up at 6 in the morning. For those that suffer from neurodevelopmental and neurodegenerative diseases, as well as during normal aging, sleep-wake balance can be heavily compromised and likely worsens these conditions. If any of you were suddenly forced to stay continually awake, cognitive functions would decline, and eventually complete sleep deprivation could lead to systemic inflammation, psychosis, potentially even death. Obviously, sleep must be doing something very important, and this notion is underscored by the fact that study to date, basically every animal with a nervous system seems to do it. The main question is, why do we need to sleep? There are some good ideas floating around, but it remains one of the great unsolved questions in modern biology. For whatever the reason, you cannot simply stay awake indefinitely. That is why there is a process called sleep-wake homeostasis, which ensures you get the sleep that you need when you have been awake for too long. It's a familiar feeling. The longer you stay awake, the sleepier you get. The only way to resolve the issue is to get some sleep. But how does this work? How do the neurons in your brain tell you, I've been up for 2 days straight, I've got to get some sleep? The goal of my research is to understand how sleep-wake homeostasis works, because understanding this process may give insight into why we need to sleep in the first place. I am studying this problem using the genetic model organism, the fruit fly Drosophila. Why flies? Well, the most critical reason is that sleep is a universal animal behavior. Basically, every animal sleeps, including the fly. Therefore, it's likely that understanding the mechanisms that control sleep in the fly may yield insight to sleep control in all animals, including humans. So how do we use the flies to study sleep? We start by loading individual flies into glass tubes, and then we place them into little monitoring devices. When the fly is awake, it tends to walk back and forth inside the tube. The monitor counts the number of times the fly crosses the middle of the tube. It's been previously shown that if the fly doesn't cross the middle for a while, then it's likely they've entered a state which satisfies the core behavioral criteria used to define sleep in all animals. And these criteria include prolonged quiescence, so they're immobile, increased arousal thresholds, so they're less responsive to sensory stimuli, rapid reversibility, so they can be woken up, therefore we know they're not dead or in a coma, and homeostatic regulation. If we sleep deprive a fly all night, it'll sleep more the next day to compensate, just like how you would. Other advantages of the flies include being small and manageable and having a quick generation time. They go from embryo to adult in 10 days, and each female can lay hundreds of eggs. And this allows us to examine many animals in parallel. Each monitor can hold 32 flies, and we have 80 of these monitors in the lab, so data can be collected from a couple thousand flies at a time. They also have a small and numerically simple nervous system. Remember, my goal is to understand how sleep-wake homeostasis is implemented in the brain. To tackle this problem, my approach is to first identify the neurons that are involved in sleep-wake homeostasis and then understand how they function. It's a lot easier to find such neurons in a brain that contains 100,000, like the fly, rather than closer to 100 million neurons like the mouse, or billions in the case of humans. In fact, another advantage of the fly is that I already have a good place to start. Specific neuronal populations which are involved in sleep-wake homeostasis have already been identified. One such neuronal population functions as the sleep trigger, the output of the sleep homeostasis mechanism. Using genetic tools, sophisticated genetic tools in the fly, we can specifically activate just these roughly 25 neurons and no other neurons in the whole brain. Doing so forces the flies to fall straight to sleep. If we remove the activation, the flies are free to wake back up. Another interesting population are the ring neurons. These peculiar neurons are literally shaped like a ring. Some ring neurons have been identified by Mark Wu's lab at Johns Hopkins to be critical for sleep-wake homeostasis. Activating these neurons causes the flies to behave like they have been sleep deprived, even if they got a full night's sleep. I'm examining how neurons, such as these, interact with other neurons in the brain to accomplish their tasks, because neurons do not exist in isolation. They must operate within a network to carry out their function. Dissecting these networks should be possible in the fly, where we can record and manipulate the activity of specific neuronal populations and test for interactions. And these networks tell the brain information such as, I'm awake right now, I have been awake for this long, I should be sleepy, and it's time to go to bed. In the long run, understanding the circuit mechanisms of sleep-wake homeostasis may enable us to start asking the first big picture question, why do we sleep in the first place? As you all go through your daily lives, you're constantly reminded by how important it is to get a good night's sleep. From ZQuil to sleep number beds and sleep apps on your phones. Eventually, I'm pretty optimistic that through basic research and medicine, we can identify some conserved options, some conserved pathways, even though this is very basic science. If we understand sleep homeostasis, we might not be able to only help the average person get a better night's sleep, but also provide insight for relevant challenges facing sleep medicine, such as insomnia, hypersomnia, and narcolepsy. So again, I'm optimistic that through basic research in medicine, poor sleep can become a thing of the past. But for now, I hope everyone here makes a priority out of getting a good night's sleep every night.